Yeah, sure.
Yes.
You know, the Australian government spent something like $50 billion on a broadband internet,
Right.
and we still don't have it.
It's not on fire, is it?
We still don't have it. No,
Well,
not on fire, but
yeah.
it should be fired.
Nice. Well, with your fires and our floods, we're lucky we got anything. So, yep, I will mute myself, and hopefully that will be the perfect end to your audio problems. Cheers, Chris.
Okay, we'll continue. Thank you, everyone. I'm not technically not savvy enough, obviously, but anyway, it's working fine. Now, I'll be talking to you tonight. It's night time here. I'll be talking about the ACMA RCM, in general RCM approvals in Australia. And we'll finish up with an emphasis on cellular and IoT devices. Now, cellular devices is very common nowadays, and it appears in just about everything, especially with the Internet of Things. So, unfortunately, for the customers, at least, the approval process is quite complicated because it involves all aspects of ACMA regulations. So hopefully after tonight, after this session, that everyone will know what to do, or at least know questions to ask. So we'll start off by looking at the ACMA regulations, labelling requirements and records, keeping requirements. We'll have a look at the electrical safety requirements. Then we'll look at in detail the EMC labelling requirements and notice, the regulations. Then we'll look at the radio regulations, and then which will also include short-range devices and similar related regulations. Then we'll look at telecommunications equipment, devices connecting to the telecommunications network, or the PSTN, which also includes the cellular network in Australia. And we'll finish up by looking at the RF exposure regulations and requirements in Australia. Now, I apologise, I've got a touch of laryngitis tonight, so every now and again my voice will disappear. And that was me having a drink of water. Right, so we'll continue on. But for those of you that don't know our company, we've been in business since 1992. We've got 5 labs in the group, 2 of which are in Melbourne, 1 of which is in Sydney, 1 in Auckland, New Zealand, and we've got an office in Tokyo. There's no lab as such. And we're a NATA accredited, which is ILAC MRA lab organisation, ISO 17025, and we, like most test labs around the world, we try to service world markets, and we could get most of those logos. There's our building, which was first built in about 2007. Moved in. There's our original oats in Sydney. That was in a valley in the Blue Mountains. Most of that's been burnt, and just a week ago, it all got flooded. So yeah, it's been through the whole 40 horsemen of the apocalypse. And the compulsory kangaroo shots for a presentation from Australia. And that's our first test site, 3-metre test site, which was built up in the hills back in late 1890 or thereabouts. No, 1980, sorry. And there's a cute little Aussie bird. And that was our open area test site up until a while ago. It's now been replaced by, that was when, by the way, that was when engineers really earned their money. That's snow, you can see. And that's now. That's our current test site, the 10-metre oats open area test site. And there's no spiders or snakes or bad weather to contend with. And we can fit just about anything in there. So just a bit of background on who we are. We've been in business since 1992. We're accredited to 17025 and 17020 for inspection. We've got various labs around the place. We can do EMF, SAR testing, wireless, telecoms testing and radio. And we're accredited to assess products, not necessarily test, but accredited to assess products to the cellular requirements, the ACMA cellular requirements. And we're also a notified body under the EMC directive for Europe, the CE marking. Not that we do much in that area nowadays, but it looks good on the adverts. And for anyone interested, we do provide a local representative service, although it is quite complicated to be legal. So I advise you to be very careful when paying money to local representatives. It's not as easy as straightforward as one thinks. We're also accredited we're an FCC accredited lab, ISCD accredited. We're recognised in Taiwan and Singapore and other places. Now, the usual disclaimer, we are, you need legal advice. I'm an armchair lawyer, armchair regulation expert. So we don't accept any liability whatsoever for anything I say. I'm sorry. We'll start off by looking at the RCM requirements, or regulatory compliance mark. In Australia, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, or the ACMA, as we call it, is the regulator involved in regulating all aspects of radiocoms, telecoms, wireless. Basically, all media is regulated by the ACMA, even the newspapers. And the ACMA do not regulate electrical safety except for telecoms products where it's mandatory. We do. The ACMA does regulate every other aspect. But the states in Australia, the states have responsibility for electrical safety regulations. And just recently, they formed an authority or a council called ERAC, Electrical Regulatory Authorities Council, and they, which also includes New Zealand and all states, and they regulate electrical safety. And all aspects. Now, we'll have a look at the electrical safety requirements as we go through. But getting back to ACMA, the ACMA regulations in Australia are regulated. The regulations govern all aspects of communications, and including to make sure the network works properly, to make sure that, when you plug a telephone and it works properly, to make sure that, you know, when you dial the emergency call number, which in Australia is 000, to make sure that works. And also to make sure that the integrity of the system is maintained. So that's why we have regulations in Australia, and I'm sure that that's the reason why regulations exist elsewhere in the world. Quality of products is not regulated by the ACMA, but it is a consumer issue. There's 4 main ACMA regulations. They're called labelling notices. There's one to do with EMC. There's one that regulates the labelling notices also have companion standards. The standards are actually regulations. They're called standards just to confuse us. But they have the companion notices. So with the EMC labelling notice, there's a companion EMC standard, which basically lists all the standards that are required, or the applicable EMC standards. There's also the Radiocommunications labelling notice, which has a companion mandatory standards notice. There's the Telecommunications labelling notice, which has also within it a whole lot of technical standards. And there's also the Electromagnetic Radiation notice, or the RF exposure notice, which also has a standard listed in it. So to comply in Australia, you've got to comply with all labelling notices, all applicable labelling notices. It's similar to the CE marking notices, CE marking regulations. You have, you know, where you must comply with all applicable CE marking directives. The approach is similar. So the compliance, the labelling notices have different levels of compliance. Now, it might seem odd to have a level of compliance because, you know, you either comply or you don't. But in Australia, they're called levels. So level 1 compliance is intended for low-risk devices. So the compliance requirements are based on what the associated risk is. So with a low-risk device, devices such as something like a battery-operated toy or a calculator, they're due to be low risk. So EMC compliance records requirements are not as severe as other higher risk products. So with low risk products, compliance is still necessary, but you need to not keep the level of records that you need to keep much reduced. So medium risk devices, which probably includes just about every product on the market, except for high risk devices. Medium risk devices you're required to keep description of the device. This is the compliance records. You need to keep a description of the device, a technical description, a declaration of conformity, and a test report. Or now, the important thing here is that accredited test reports are not essential, but if on request, the regulator can demand an accredited test report if you haven't got one, if they suspect that your product's not compliant. Now, high-risk devices, there's not many of these. There's some under the Telecommunications labelling notice, but under EMC and general electrical products, there's only the Group 2 ISM or CISPA 11 type products for EMC compliance. So Group 2 ISM equipment, for those of you that are not familiar with CISPA 11, include things like RF generators and RF welders and equipment that is very likely to cause interference. And there's more of these, more high-risk products under the Telecommunications labelling notice. So when you get a test report, a product tested, you really should take care to choose the lab that's accredited for your standard. Now, we see a lot of test reports from overseas, and sometimes the lab may be accredited, but the test report is not endorsed with the accreditation body's logos. So that can cause problems. That will cause problems when an accredited test report is required. So make sure that if you need an accredited test report, make sure that the lab you choose is accredited for that standard. And just back one step and be mindful that if the the regulator in Australia asks for proof of compliance, they will often ask for an accredited test report, although it's not mandatory. They do reserve the right to ask for it. So what do you do to comply in Australia? Well, first of all, you identify the applicable labelling notices that applies to your product. You identify the technical standards that labelling notice calls up. In the case of EMC, it'll be EMC standards. In the case of radio, it'll be radio standards. In the case of telecoms, it'll be telecommunications standards. Identify all the standards that apply to your product. Then demonstrate compliance. In general, it's by testing in a lab, although other options are available, such as the old TCF route, which is still acceptable in Australia by competent body TCF route. So once you've established compliance and label your product, you can issue a declaration of conformity, sign a declaration of conformity. There's a template. If you Google ACMA DOC, you'll get a template. And mind you, overseas suppliers can fill it in a declaration of conformity, but it's usually it's the Australian supplier or importer that bears full responsibility for that declaration. So overseas suppliers can wash their hands of all legal requirements. It's really a contractual requirement with the importers in Australia or the distributors. Now, having established compliance, you should also be registered as an ACMA supplier in the national database. Now, that can be done online. It only needs to be done once. And really, and the beauty of it is there's no fees. You only register once, and that gives you the right to use the RCM logo on your product. And remember, though, that the RCM logo can only appear on there when you comply with all the applicable regulations. So having registered as a supplier in Australia, you can then label the product with the RCM, and that's it. Then that's the sole responsibility of the importer in Australia. Now, you may remember the old C-tick mark. I don't know if you can see the pointer, but the C-tick mark and the A-tick mark recently in 2015 or thereabouts were abolished, and we now have a composite mark, the ATIC, the RCM. Now, with the RCM, it's Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand's often referred to as another state of Australia, but a lot of Kiwis will be upset by that suggestion. But we do share a lot of trade. There's a free trade agreement between the two countries, and even the RCM has been harmonised in most cases. Now, we'll have a look at which cases are not harmonised. So when you apply the RCM, it's in many cases, not all cases, it's also valid in New Zealand. Now, regulations, EMC regulations are harmonised between the two countries. However, electrical, and so is electrical safety. However, telecommunications and radio standards are not harmonised, which means the RCM is not valid when it relates to radio products. Okay, I'll just have a drink. So, to register as a supplier, you can register on the ERAC website, Electrical Regulatory Authorities Council. They have a website, and you choose the ACMA registration path and register as an ACMA supplier. Or you can use the safety registration path to register as a responsible supplier for electrical safety. Now, when you register as a responsible supplier for electrical safety, there's fees involved. Every product must be registered where applicable. Every product must be registered, and there's a fee associated with that registration. So only high-risk products, high risk under the safety regulations, products need to be registered. But other products can be registered on a voluntary basis. Now, the supplier code number, as it used to be called, is no longer permitted or required in Australia. What sort of compliance records do you need to keep? Well, for EMC, they need to be English. They can be in electronic form. They need to contain a description of the device, a technical description, a test report that shows compliance, a declaration of conformity is required, and where you have a local representative for regulations, those details should be required. It should be available as well. Now, the RCM label is mandatory with ERAC under electrical safety and ACMA standards. Now, in general, mandatory standards include IEC, CISPA, or EN, or the Australian version, ASNZS standards. But most of these standards, the applicable standards, could be found under the respective labelling notice. Now, in Australia, if your product is covered by other regulators, such as medical or automotive, they don't need to be registered. You don't need to be registered as a supplier. Right, who applies the RCM label? Well, it could be anyone, basically. Anyone can apply it. But you must have the permission of the local importer or registered supplier. You should have the permission, written permission, from the registered supplier in Australia. But it can be applied basically anywhere in the world. So when you're manufacturing, you can apply it at the point of manufacture, or you can, whether you're overseas or in Australia. Now remember that the liability for the RCM label product always rests with the importer or the supplier in Australia. So if you're overseas, you're safe. Who can sign the declaration of conformity? Well, in a nutshell, just about anyone can sign that declaration of conformity, but the liability always rests with the supplier in Australia. Now, a common question, our product is CE marked. Is that okay? Do we have to apply the RCM label? Well, the answer is yes, because the CE mark is not recognised legally in Australia. The same with the FCC logo, it's not recognised in Australia. So going back to the CE, sorry, I'll just go back. Yeah. However, the CE mark itself is not recognised in Australia. However, you may use the CE test report if it was done at 220 or 230 volts to show compliance in Australia for the RCM compliance. So you don't need to retest. However, with the FCC, it's a bit different because the FCC voltage, the voltage in the US is 115, 60 hertz or thereabouts. So in theory, the product should be retested the local mains voltage. The same in Japan, the VCCI, although the standard is the same, essentially the same as ISPA 32, the test voltage should be what it is in Australia. Now we'll have a quick look at safety regulations in Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the Australian states and territories, as we call them. Territory is not quite a state, but they have got a local government, but they're not a state under the definition of a state. So all 8 states and 2 territories, sorry, did I say 8? 6 states and 2 territories have formed the ERAC, Electrical Regulatory Authority Council, which includes New Zealand, and they've come up with common regulations, or ERAC. Now with ERAC, they have high-risk products, which used to be called declared products or declared items or declared articles, or prescribed items. They're called prescribed items because they're published in a official government gazette, which means certification is mandatory for those devices. And prescribed items or declared articles include such things as domestic appliances, washing machines, irons, toasters, refrigerators, that sort of device where traditionally they can kill people if they malfunction or there's a safety problem with them. So they're used in the home, and they're generally all declared articles, and they're high risk, which means they have to be certified, tested in an accredited lab, certified, and then registered on the ERAC website. Now, declared articles or high-risk products include such things as consumer devices, domestic appliances, TV receivers, battery chargers, transformers, mains adapters, that sort of thing. And there's a link on the slide, and if you click on it, it will take you to a whole list of these so-called articles. You can download the file. Sorry, I'll skip one. So prescribed items or declared articles. If it's not on the declared items list, or it's not a prescribed item, it's generally there's minimum safety requirements, but it's not a mandatory requirement unless, of course, your product kills someone or injures someone. Then you'd be in all sorts of strife, rightly so. But there's minimum safety requirements on all products, and it's defined by ASNZS 3820. Now, all that standard calls up is, it's an overarching standard which calls up basically product electrical safety standards. So there are minimum safety requirements on non-prescribed items, but the advantage of this is to the suppliers is that they don't need to register the products or list them on the website and pay certification body fees or registration fees. Now in Australia, the EN standards, we get a lot of reports to the EN, to the CE low voltage directive under EN standards, and quite often you don't need to retest to the Australian standard, but quite often there's a difference. Testing is common. I need another drink. Now, if you want to know, if you're an official list of the prescribed items, it can be found in ASNZS 4417.2. 4417.1 gives the rules on the use of the RCM logo. So 4417.2 gives a detailed list of all high-risk products or prescribed items or declared articles. Now, if your product is not a prescribed item or doesn't appear in that list of under ASNZS 4417.2, if it's not on that list, well then you still need to comply with basic minimum safety standards, but registration is not essential. But the RCM label still must be applied because it comes under the ACMA regulations for EMC and radio. So the RCM label is always applicable even though the products are not high risk. Now, with the RCM logo, it must be ASNZS 4417.1. Gives details of the artwork and other details on how to apply the RCM logo. Right, for a start, it must not be easily removable. It must be durable, whatever that means. And it should be on the external surface of the device, or one surface that's easily accessible to the user. For example, in the battery compartment where the battery is removable. We'll now have a look at the EMC regulations. The ACMA regulates EMC in Australia, and it's important to note that there's no such thing as immunity regulations. And when you get the slides, there's a link to the list of ACMA compliance requirements. If you click on it, you'll probably be able to download the list of standards in particular. Now, the list of standards is what you expect. It basically includes most standards in the official journal of the European Union, and most of those are included. So you don't have to test or have a report to the Australian New Zealand standard. You can use the EN equivalent. Now, the Australian versions of CISPA are easily identifiable because they have the same number, which was good. In the old days, they all had different numbers which had no relationship with the CISPA number. Now, as I mentioned, you can use the EN equivalent, the EN number used in the official journal. Now, in Australia, CISPA 25 is not a mandatory standard. In general, devices that are connected to automotive or aftermarket devices that's sold for fitting into vehicles are generally tested to CISPA 32. Now, anything that's aftermarket intended for fitment to an automotive vehicle is CISPA 32, not CISPA 25, although it's a tougher standard, but CISPA 32 is the applicable standard. Now, there's quite a few exemptions under the EMC requirements, under the ACMA EMC requirements. Devices that fall under other jurisdictions outside ACMA, for example, medical devices, automotive, are excluded. So if your device is a registered medical product, you don't have to label it with the RCM. Unless, of course, it's a radio product, which then makes it very similar, if not the same as the European requirements, because it comes under the Radio Equipment Directive. If it's a radio transmitter, it comes under the ACMA regulations and must be labelled with the RCM. Prototypes are excluded. Military defence equipment is excluded. Anything with a power consumption less than 1 milliwatt is excluded. Now that's, I think from memory, the FCC excludes things which have a power consumption of less than 6 nanowatts. 1 milliwatt is at least 1,000 times higher. So we're pretty easy in Australia. Battery-operated devices are excluded. Now, the definition of battery-operated device is in the regulation, the EMC labelling notice, so you've got to make sure that before you exclude your product from EMC compliance, that it fits the definition of a battery-operated device. Essentially, it means that any device that is operated by an internal battery that cannot be operated by an external supply is deemed to be battery operated. For example, the device that's fitting in an automotive vehicle, that's going to operate off of your car battery, but it's not excluded under that definition. Be careful when you interpret the exclusion for battery-operated devices. Spare parts are excluded. Components are excluded. Devices that are sold to another manufacturer for inclusion in the final product are excluded, very similar to the EMC directive. And fixed installation. Now, the definition of fixed installation is very similar to the European definition or interpretation. I'm not sure if the European EMC directive has a definition. There's the voltage exclusion, and there's if a manufacturer or supplier in Australia is a member of an industry body that regulates, or there is a voluntary code for automotive manufacturers or the like, or construction machinery. If they're a member of that organisation, then they can get away without the labelling requirements. But once again, be careful if you're claiming an exemption on that basis. And that's the end of part 3. That's a good shot of a koala. They're not bears, by the way, for all you people overseas. They're koalas, not bears. So, devices are becoming very complicated today with the Internet of Things and wireless networks everywhere. That's just a summary of various standards used in the wireless world. We have a short-range devices standard in Australia, and that applies to things like gateways and, short-range devices, transmitters, and related equipment. Now, in Australia, it's very easy to comply. Nothing like the US or Europe, where you'd be testing forever. In Europe, in the US, you've got to certify forever, and it's quite complicated and tedious and expensive and onerous. In Australia, it's really simple. Short-range devices are exempt from certification. There's no certification devices requirements, and they all devices, short-range devices, are allowed to be operated under the so-called class license. Class license lists a whole lot of products as low interference potential devices. So basically all short-range devices could be operated under a class license, which is free. So it's easy in Australia. and it's that easy. There's no certification required. There's no registration of products. There's no fees, very important. So all devices, short-range devices, can be operated legally and sold legally with minimum requirements. However, your short-range devices are not afforded protection from interference from other devices. So it's your responsibility if you're sharing that spectrum to accept any interference that you receive. However, all these short-range devices have requirements for RF safety. In Australia, the applicable short-range devices standard is ASNZS 4268, and that's recently been changed to make it really easy to comply with that standard. Essentially, any European report can be used, FCC report can be used, the Canada report can be used to show compliance with ASNZS 4268. Now, once again, the labeling notice for Radiocommunications, once you get the slides, you can click on the link and you can get a copy of it. So the Radiocommunications labeling notice has about 15 or so mandatory standards associated with that notice. Now, the mandatory standards include the short-range devices standard, things like for push-to-talk transmitters and the like. Now, unfortunately, not all these standards are harmonised with New Zealand, so you need to be careful and check to see if the radio standard is harmonised with New Zealand or not. Otherwise, you will have to label it for the New Zealand requirements, which is the R-NZ number, and other regulations apply. So, the important thing though is that Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and similar standards are all harmonised. So, if your device has got Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, you don't need to register in New Zealand. You don't need to market for New Zealand. The RCM label is all that is required. Now, back in the wires days, I've still got a system that looks like that, under my TV. And this is the state of the art, and obviously got a lot of advantages, especially to the complicated systems that involve a lot of wires. But you've got to make sure that you're complying with the appropriate radio regulation. Now, as I mentioned before, it's easy in Australia, but one trap is you've got to make sure that the frequency you're using, the band you're using, is legally permissible in Australia. There's a couple that are not permissible. For example, 915 to 928. In the US, we get a lot of products here that's 902 to 928. But you can't use 902 to 950 in Australia, or New Zealand for that matter. New Zealand, unfortunately, New Zealand doesn't have a harmonised standard for the 915 megahertz devices. There's a couple of additional tests you've got to do for New Zealand. And so if you're using 915 for your Internet of Things device, make sure that you test to the New Zealand requirements. The New Zealand requirements are not that different. It's just that the bandage measurements have a lot more sensitivity than the standard FCC type measurements. Now, we're getting close to the end. We'll now look at the Telecommunications Labelling Notice, which regulates all devices connecting to the PSTN, including the cellular network. Devices such as mobile phones, satellite phones, cordless phones, normal telephones and voice over IP devices, ADSL modems, etc., are all governed by regulated by the ACMA Telecommunications Labelling Notice. And that labelling notice is obtainable by clicking on that link, which will be on the slides when you get it. That's a significant document. There's quite a lot of pages, and it's a bit more complicated than the other stuff. But nevertheless, if you're used to reading regulations, you could probably make good sense out of it, or some sense. Now, the Telecommunications Labelling Notice, once you comply with the telecommunications, you've got to fill in a declaration of conformity. And the declaration of conformity must include a whole lot of information, including the model number, the name of the manufacturer or the importer in Australia, etc., etc. The software versions, the applicable technical standards, and there's a whole lot of information that's got to be included in the Declaration of Conformity. And the records, the technical compliance records, have got to include, well, for a start, they've got to be English, and it's got to include a whole lot of other information, including the versions of the software. Now, I've got ASNZS 60950 here, but the replacement standard 62838 or whatever it is, I'm not a safety guy, so I can't rattle it off. But the latest replacement IEC standard can be used in its place. Now, it is different from the EN standard. If you use the IEC standard with Australian deviations, you'll be covered for that. Good. If you use EN 60950, if you use the IEC version, or if it's a CB report with Australian differences, Australian deviations, that's all you need to do. Now, applicable devices for cellular, applicable standards for cellular devices, there's two major standards. There's ASCA SO42.1. There's ASCA SO42.4 for LTE devices. Now, 0.3 is obsolete because that used to be GSM devices, which is now obsolete in Australia. That no longer applies. There's also a link to those standards on the presentation when you get it. So if you click, they're industry standards that are available free of charge. So if any device connects to the cellular network, they've got to comply with SO42.1 and 0.4, 4.4 or both. Now, in Australia, if you're marketing mobile phones or cellular phones, it must be able to dial 000 emergency number. That's one of the common problems for mobile phones imported in Australia. They either dial 911 or 112, but not 000. So make sure that your device dials 000 before it's offered for sale in Australia. And also, there's no way known you can test that number if you're overseas, if you're outside of Australia. Now, I'm saying that because, we get a lot of stuff. We're obviously getting a lot of reports that say compliance with 000, but the only way you can make that check is to actually follow the standards, SO 42.1, which says you must dial 000 and they must answer, and you must say, oh, this is a test, goodbye. So that number is not accessible if you're outside of Australia. So the only way you know it'll work is by calling that number from within Australia. Now, the SO 42.4 has requirements for, is intended for things like 3G and 4G devices. Now, one of the common traps is, people integrate modules into a final product, integrate modules and form a final product. But even though the modules might be approved for and even though you might see a declaration of conformity for the module, it doesn't mean there's no other requirements. Safety always applies. Electrical safety always applies to mobile cellular products, and also it always and there's a requirement for Sister 32 on a finished product, and there's also requirement for spurious emissions. Now you can get that information or those requirements. You can find that in the standard itself. SO 42.4 has a list of what you need to do to approve your 3G or 4G device. So in a nutshell, we find the spurious emissions report is nearly always missing. Now, in Australia, we also have a different band that's not used in Europe. Band, is it 5 or 8? The 850 megahertz, the one that's used in the US, is so you need to have the spurious emissions report or test on that using that band, as well as the European bands. So the SO 42.4 requirements, and it's really compliance with SO 42.4 and 0.1 is really only a documentation gathering exercise. Things like declarations of conformity for the module manufacturer and the like, and the manufacturer themselves. But spurious emission reports are always commonly missing. Now in Australia, there's no such thing as an RCM approved module, because particularly if the module, once again, the definition of a module is open to interpretation. What's a module? Well, to my way of thinking, a module is a component that you solder into a board using the manufacturer's guidance instructions. But other people might consider a module things like something that plugs into a PC, for example. A USB dongle would be considered to be a module. So if the device is a solder-in device, it's able to be soldered into a printed circuit board, I call that a module. And there's no such thing as an approved module in Australia if it's like that, because it's considered a component. And really, you can't show that a component complies with all the regulations or the standards. However, if you got the module manufacturer's test reports, you can get out of testing the transmitter parameters. So you don't need to do any transmitter testing if you've got the module manufacturer's test reports. But the module manufacturers often even do a safety test, and they have a safety test report, but really you can't use that report for safety or in your final integrated product. In the same way, you can't use a SISPA 32 report in the integrated product. You've got to test the final integrated product to SISPA 32. And spurious emissions. So why are spurious emissions important? Well, when you integrate a module, there's no way of knowing if spurious emissions are generated without actually testing the final product, because they're intermods and they're unpredictable, and sometimes they appear random. And so, unfortunately, you've got to test the final product for spurious emissions. The spurious emissions can cause severe network problems for the mobile phone carriers. They can cause interference and with other bands outside the band that you're operating in. So they are important. And here's a case in point. This spurious emission up at the 4.8 gig exceeds the limits for so it exceeds the limits anyway. So that's one reason why SISPA 30, why spurious emissions are important. Here's another case in point where intermods, third-order intermods can cause failures. So this is actually a case history from our testing, and we show this to some customers. Well, you need to show this to some customers to prove that they're not wasting their money or not performing a needless test. So in Australia, you've got other requirements on the cellular products. You've got EMC, the accessories, and don't forget human exposure to RF. And we'll have a quick look at that. And 60950, which the latest standard is 65358 or something, sorry. Number escapes me. I'm a safety guy. And the radio standards always apply. So ISO 42.4, there's requirements for 908-2. The same report from the module manufacturer can be used. The same for the 908-13. The module manufacturer report can be used to show compliance with ISO 42.4. And STS means standard telephone service, defined in ISO 42.1 and .4. So ISO 42.1 and .4, sorry, not .1, requires compliance with FCC Part 22 rules where the 850 megahertz band is used. Now, you can show that compliance by simply downloading the FCC ID certificate or the certificate of grant, the FCC grant certificate. And so it's, as I mentioned before, it's just a ISO 42.1 and .4 is a documentation gathering exercise. And all devices connected to the cellular network under the Telecommunications labelling notice need to report a safety test report. And it's got to be accredited because that's considered a high risk standard and it must always be accredited. Accredited test report, that is. And reiterate that EN 60950 is not acceptable. Now we'll have a quick look at the human exposure requirements. The ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, has adopted the ARPANSA, Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, ARPANSA. It's a bit of a mouthful. And which in turn have adopted the ICNIRP recommendations, same as in Europe. So the ACMA EMR standard calls up the ICNIRP levels, reference levels, and protection requirements. So the SAR limits are the same as Europe, and the other limits are the same as Europe. Now, the only difference is in Australia, we've got to use ASNZS 2772.2 to do the measurements and the field strength calculations if required. Now, SAR limits are different, can be different around the world. So this slide just reiterates that. And as an example, you know, you can be compliant in Australia or Europe. For example, you make a 5.8 gigahertz measurement of SAR in the US under the FCC rules, and you get a very bad failure of 5.16 milliwatt. And the limit, remember, in the US is 1.6. So it's quite a bad failure. However, that same measurement will yield the result of 0.97 watt per gram using the ICNIRP or European and Australian calculation method, measurement method. So be careful when you're dealing with SAR because it may look good on the surface, but when you look closely, it may be a fail. Now, with SAR measurements, with the ACMA EMR standard, there's two ways of showing compliance. There's by measurement methods, there's three ways. Making reference level measurements using a field strength meter, such as conventional field strength meter. There's SAR measurements, or there's by calculation. They can do reference level calculations if you know the antenna characteristics and the transmitted power. You can determine that, and if it's more than 20 centimetres from the body, you can determine the levels, exposure levels by calculation. Now this table just essentially summarises the ACMA EMR standard 2014 and how you assess against it. So where it's, if the device is less than 2.5 centimetres from the body, and if it's less than 20 milliwatts, well, then there's no further assessment required. And you can presume compliance without any tests whatsoever. If it's used within 20 centimetres of the body, well, you've either got to make an SAR measurement, or you can use calculations, or you can use field strength measurement with the meter. I must update this slide. So adding Wi-Fi modules and the like in your product. If you use it as so-called approved module, you don't need to spend too much time and money or on testing in Australia. It's all a self-declaration process. Whereas if you go to Europe, there's a lot of, it's still self-declaration, but there's a lot of testing involved if you want to self-declare. And if you go to the US, you've got to certify, test and certify. So Australia is quite simple from that regard. Now, once you integrate a whole lot of different, have a system involving a whole lot of different transmitters, it's obviously a lot more complicated. But it's not so easy, but it is easy in Australia. Now, one device, for example, a 915 megahertz device, it's got an external power supply. Well, if it's got an external power supply, you need to test a CISPA 32 or EN 55032. Or if you got to report to the radio part, you need to comply with ASNZS 4268, or you can show compliance with that standard by having a report to EN 300-328 or 893 in the case of 5 gig Wi-Fi, or even FCC Part 15C report, which is, you know, if you have the FCC ID number, you can download that report from the FCC website. Now, bearing in mind that also the RF exposure requirements still apply. Now, for gateway cellular devices, you need the ACMA, all 4 ACMA labelling notices apply. Okay. The EMC applies, the Radiocomms applies, the labelling, the EMR applies, or human exposure, and the Telecoms labelling notice applies. And if you've got a power adapter or a charger, that's considered high risk under ERAC rules, so that must be registered. So avoid the use of chargers if you can, and power adapters. However, if you buy one from within Australia, it will generally, well, the onus of compliance is then on the supplier. So we always recommend our Australian clients buy local ones when someone else has done all the onerous certification and registration work. Now, if you've got a Saudi device, remember 632 or N55032 always applies. If it's battery operated, you can argue a case for not worrying about it. The spurious emissions always apply. The -1, 908-1, and the FCC Part 22H spurious emission requirements. And that's required so you comply with SO 42.4. And don't forget the human exposure requirements. Right, so my advice to manufacturers is always determine your target markets before you start your testing or before you design your product. Start your testing. And it's much easier to go to a lab that's got the accredited to all the target markets. And that concludes the presentation. About my failing voice. And there's some contact info there on the last slide if anyone wants to make contact. Thank you.
Cool.
I'll hand back to Mike.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Chris. I've sat in your presentations before, but I feel like there was some good new information in this one, and it was actually nice to be able to sit and concentrate and listen to it all. So I personally have learnt quite a bit. I have got some questions for you. If your voice can handle a few questions, hopefully nothing too stressful for you. All right, first question then. So you talked about low risk or high risk or medium risk products. How does a manufacturer know which one applies? Like, is there a list or guidance or anything?
Yeah, it's in the labelling notices. It's in the relevant labelling notice.
Right, okay.
For example, the safety test is always a high risk test. High risk, categorised as high risk. And ASNZS 4417.2 has a whole list of high risk products.
Okay, so it's like the product type could be low risk, but it's also based on whether the safety needs doing. Is that what you're saying? That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So if your product uses a power adapter, for example, or a battery charger, it's only the battery chargers that is high risk. If it's a standalone charger.
Right. Okay. Actually, somebody did ask about those portable power banks. I guess they mean the sort of batteries that you can charge them up at home and then you carry them around in your bag and you recharge your phone with them. I don't know.
Yeah, well, Australia's pretty slack on battery standards and regulations. There's really no applicable regulation on the batteries, except of course you're not allowed to kill people or burn people.
These days, even that's frowned upon, is it? Cool.
Yeah.
All right, next question. If the EN standards are accepted, why do the ASNZS standards even exist?
That's a good point, because I think for many years people were wasting their time on the committee, of which I was a part of. And in the old days, the standards, EMC standards, used to have their own unique Australian number, but they wisely switched to an ASNZS system number.
Right.
But the ACMA in Australia tries to make it as easy as possible for suppliers to comply.
Right.
So they just write on the back of all EN standards for EMC anyway.
Yeah. Got you. Okay. So they're probably just like, they were a good idea in the first place to have your, I guess there are companies placing products on the market in Australia, even if they're not going to go elsewhere or haven't been elsewhere.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, cool. Next question. How about medical devices? What requirements are there for medical devices?
Medical devices are, the regulator is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, which is equivalent to the FDA, in the US.
Right.
You've got to register your product with them, and that gives you exemption from AMC regulation, but not radio regulation.
Right. Okay. Got you. So you do that medical requirement in parallel to the radio regulations, the same as you would in the USA or Europe or something.
Yes, it's similar rules. Yeah.
Right. Got you. Okay. Next one. Are the EN 301489 EMC for radio standards, are they accepted in Australia? Apparently they're not.
They are where they have a test for CISPA 32. That's acceptable.
Right. Okay. So you only care about emissions.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Sorry, I thought
You did, yeah. I'm just clarifying that. So the EMC emissions is important, but EMC immunity is not needed, right?
That's right. The 489-1 report, it may be used to show compliance with CISPA 32.
Got you.
However, some reports don't have the radiated emissions included.
That's right.
Because it could be ancillary equipment or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, in fact, you
need to be careful. As long as the report contains test data that shows compliance with CISPA 32, it's acceptable.
Got you. Yeah, like for example, the EN 301489 for Wi-Fi or cellular. The radiated emissions doesn't need to be done in the 301489 because it will have been done in the radio standard. So I guess as long as so that might explain why it's not on the ACMA list, I guess, because it's.
That's right. We find in a lot of cases the 489-1 doesn't have the radiated emissions.
No, exactly. In most cases, in fact. Yeah, cool. All right.
It is acceptable.
It is acceptable, yeah, if it covers the 55032 requirements.
Yes.
Cool. Now, I remember one time in the past, you said that IEC 60950 is mandatory and IEC 62368 is not yet accepted. Is that still the case?
No, it is accepted.
It is accepted now.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well,
got
I think it's 62638. I can't remember. I'm not really
62368. Yeah. All right. Cool. But it would be the
IEC.
Is
acceptable.
Brilliant. Okay. Good. So, but it would be the IEC one, not the EN one. Yeah. Got it.
The safety standard that's safety standard. For the telecommunications labelling notice, it must always be accredited.
Got you.
And it must have the Australian deviations in it.
Yeah. All right. Now, next question. So, are the requirements grandfathered like they are in the USA? Like if you manufacture and you test a product and you authorize it and you start selling it, and then later on, let's say you've been using the EN standards for the European standards. If those standards change or get updated, obviously in Europe you need to go back to the lab and reassess to the latest version of the standard. But what about Australia? Do you have to do the same there?
No, you don't have to do the same.
Right.
The applicable standard is the standard that applies when you first brought it onto the market.
Got you. First, the product
so you
type
don't have to,
goes on the market.
You don't have to test it again if the standard changes.
Cool. Okay, that's good. That's different to the EU then.
Yeah.
Next question. Do all radio transmitters need an in-country rep?
No. Well, they do. Sorry. The ACMA regulations require an in-country rep, and so do the safety regulations. So, the answer is yes. They need an in-country rep. Yes.
Cool. Next question. Is it wrong to issue an SDOC for a cellular solder down module? So if they have test reports for the ASCA S042.1 and S042.4, if they've tested the module as a radio, is it wrong to issue a DOC for the module?
Well, I asked the regulator that same question.
Yeah.
And the answer was, if it complies with SO42, it's not wrong. But it makes sense to me that it is a component. It's got no function on its own, by itself.
Yeah.
So therefore it's a component. And how can you might as well label a resistor with the RCM.
Yeah. So kind of similar to Europe, but worded differently. In Europe, if you make a component which is only going to be installed in something else and cannot do anything by itself, then it wouldn't be under the scope of the RED. Whereas if you make a radio module in Europe where all the radio is on that module, you must CE mark it to the RED because it is a radio. So it's similar but different, I guess, to Europe.
Yeah, similar but different, and really the module manufacturers' reports, all they get you out of is testing the radio transmitter parameters.
Yeah. So probably the most useful thing a module manufacturer can do is do all the testing and then give the results to the installer.
Yes, do all the testing, and at least the installer doesn't have to do the radio transmitter testing again.
Exactly. So
but all the other tests need to be done.
Yeah. Got you. Yeah, all the EMC emissions and the safety.
Yes.
So very similar to Europe in that sense. Okay, what about a two-way radio that is connected to the LTE cellular device via a cable or wireless?
Hang on. Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
Two-way radio.
I'm not sure I understood it myself. What about a two-way radio that is connected to an LTE cellular device, either via cable or via a wireless? I guess if it's connected via wireless, then it's a separate radio, isn't it? A separate product.
Yeah. Look, we've seen a lot of these LTE devices that operate just data, right?
Yeah.
And the SO42.1 and everything applies. All the applicable standards still apply.
Yeah.
So where it uses the telecommunications network, all the telecommunications labelling notice applies.
Got you. Yeah.
So you look at also SAR and EMC and all the usual applies.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Right. Well, I'm at the end of my list of questions, and we've had everybody on the call for over 90 minutes now. So I appreciate it's kind of a bit of time out of your evening, Chris, and out of everybody's day. So if there are no more questions, I will say thank you very much to everybody. Keep your eyes open for other webinars that we might host. If anybody's going to EMV in Germany in 2 or 3 weeks' time, I think 3 weeks' time, hopefully I'll see you there. I'm going to be giving a 3-hour presentation about installing radio modules and approving radio modules for the FCC, Canada, and the EU RED. Yeah, that's about it. That's my plans for March, really. So thanks again, Chris. Unless you have any more comments.
Yeah. Great. Just that if anyone's got any questions, they can feel free to email me.
Yeah, very good. We have Chris's email address on the screen here, and you're happy for everybody to have a copy of your slides, I think, Chris. Is that correct?
Yep.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, right. Well, in which case, I will close this meeting, and I hope everybody has a good day or a good night, depending on where you are. All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.